Good morning. I don't know whether to say thank you again for giving me this opportunity. I thought I had done talking yesterday. Now I'm being called upon not only to moderate, which I thought means that I won't have to speak much. I have been asked, perhaps with a sense of generosity, that I should also speak in moderating this. So I'll say a few words, and literally words that have just come to mind as I was informed this morning before meeting that I may have to say a few words before calling on the speakers. Some years ago, in fact, as far back as 1992, I got a surprise call from Boutros Ghali, who was then Secretary General, to say your name has come up to be special representative of the Secretary General on internally displaced persons. And I'm delighted to ask you to take the position. I said, this comes to me as a total surprise, and I don't know what is entailed. Could you have your people give me more details, and then I'll give you my response? He said, come on, Francis, I know you very well. He and I had both been ministers of state or foreign affairs of our respective countries. He was Minister of State and Foreign Affairs of Egypt, and I of Sudan. He said, I know you very well. I know how concerned you are with this issue. This is a crisis that affects the globe. It's a global crisis. But it is one in which Africa is the worst affected. And in Africa, it is your country of the Sudan which is the worst hit. And in Sudan, it is your people of the south who are the primary victims. I cannot see how you can say no. I'll tell them you have accepted. And later on, if you have further problems, let me know. Now, here we're talking about refugees, and I presume also IDPs. IDPs really would be refugees if they crossed international borders. But because they remain within the borders of their countries, they suffer almost exactly the same threats. But they lack one thing. They are internal, falling under the sovereignty of the state, and therefore not protected by the international community. As a matter of fact, the IDPs remain in great danger because they have not left the zone of conflict that displaced them in the first place. I said yesterday, I said most of the countries where you have these humanitarian tragedies are countries that are sharply divided. There's no common sense of state responsibility for its people. Those, the IDPs, who are identified with one warring factions or another, far from being protected, are seen as part of the enemy, denied, and perhaps even persecuted. And considering that this issue is internal and therefore very sensitive, and the United Nations Commission on Human Rights is not even one to adopt this position of special representative, Secretary General. They didn't want to have a special mandate of the Commission or a rapporteur on IDPs. So my appointment was really a compromise because they thought if he is representing the Secretary General, he would be less free than if he was a special rapporteur. And so the problem I face is how do you deal with very hot issues like sovereignty, covering responsibility, displaced populations. And I use a concept I had been developing at Brookings, looking at conflicts in Africa in the Cold War period. During the Cold War, we assumed that all these conflicts, regional and internal, were part of the proxy wars. And so they were relegated by the global bipolar control mechanisms of the superpowers. end of the Cold War and the strategic withdrawal, major powers, responsibility fell. We saw the issues in their proper context, but responsibility fell on the continents and the regions. And so we developed the notion of sovereignty as responsibility, which means I go to the president or the minister to say, I realize this problem falls under your sovereignty. It's an internal problem by definition. I'm respectful of your sovereignty, but I don't see it as a barricade against the outside world. I see it as a positive concept of state responsibility for its people. And if it needs help, to then call on the international community to assist. But if your people are suffering, dying in large numbers, and you don't help, and you don't call on the world to give access to these people help, then the world is not going to sit and watch and do nothing. It will, in one way or another, interfere. And that was the message for the 12 years I carried this mandate. It didn't work reasonably well. Even with Sudan, I said you have the worst case of displacement. Your human rights record is, to say the least, controversial. You must be seen to be caring for your IDPs, not only internally, but also to offer leadership internationally for a world response to this challenge. Some of the non-governmental organizations thought I was softening up, brightening up the Sudan. This is not the typical human rights approach. Thought I was being too kind to the government. That was not good at all. Let me just end by making a few points. Humanitarianism is always a challenge because governments, seeing these people who are suffering, not as citizens to be protected, but as part of the enemy, tend to resist foreign involvement for assistance. Also, there is an element of shame in the embarrassment that you have failed and your people are in this humanitarian tragedy because of your own failure. Then you come in a humanitarian situation, and I'm really thinking of Operation Lifeline Sudan, which was hailed internationally as the first of its kind and very much praised. But there are dilemmas in dealing with these kinds of humanitarianism. The people you are going to help fall into two kinds. Those who are desperately in need of help appreciate what you're doing. Those who are in control and may not be suffering as much as those you are going to help are suspicious and maybe even resistant. I remember doing a study for the UN to assess the drought in Darfur and also affected Ethiopia with the foreign minister of Ethiopia, an ambassador from Ethiopia. We did an assessment. And I found that in Khartoum itself, with all these international humanitarian workers, with walkie-talkies, excellent cars, well accommodated, at a time when phones were not working, Khartoum was very unwelcoming. Even though Sudan is known to be generous with refugees generally, but coming to help their own people, they were not so welcoming. I remember a very prominent professor at Khartoum University saying, why don't they just leave us alone? We have been dying anyway, we don't want them. And then I went to Darfur, and what was said earlier about Reagan Nura, people were very appreciative because they were the ones being affected. And then aid people come to do a narrow work related to aid in isolation of what is happening in the country. And they leave with nothing to continue once the base of humanitarianism is gone. So humanitarianism is not factored into helping in that process. And told we constantly have to negotiate between sovereignty and the realities on the ground to try to bring them closer together. I wrote a piece called Idealism and Realism Negotiating with Sovereignty. I won't go into the methods I use around the world in trying to persuade governments to provide protection and assistance and to allow access by the international community, and to shame them, or rather to persuade them that all this falls under your sovereignty, but to see sovereignty positively as a concept of protecting and assisting yourself, your people, in cooperation with the international community. Some human rights people don't like this language of trying to be persuasive of governments because they see it as a soft approach. And human rights is something that is universal and should be asserted with vigor. But I believe in pragmatism, that shouting from the mountaintop and sloganeering may be important. There might be room for complementarity. But it's a difficult area. We have seen what has happened to people in Darfur, happened in the South, constant suspicion and conflict that aid workers experience, and how the UN always has to use a soft method of engaging governments.